Well, hello and welcome to everyone. Welcome to Intersection, where theology and practice meet. My name is Carson Reed, the Siburt Institute, and along with my co-host Randy Harris, we want to say thank you for joining us today. Intersection is designed to take up a timely and substantive topic and bring a guest or guests along to explore and probe that with a special focus on what it means to be a leader in churches. And today our topic is an important one. What is God doing in the Brown Church? And so we want to welcome you to episode number 10 for Intersection. Our guests today are Alejandro Esguerra and Omar Palafox, and we'll invite them to pop on here with us today. We're delighted to have both of them. Omar lives in Lubbock, Texas, and is the minister for the bilingual congregation, the Colgate Church of Christ there, is about to finish a doctorate in intercultural studies at Fuller Theological Seminary, has an MDiv here from ACU. Welcome, Omar. Glad to have you with us today.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
You bet. And we've got Alejandro Esguerra coming in from Houston, Texas. Alejandro is the preaching man, pulpit minister for the Spanish congregation at the BAML Church of Christ. I'll get this spit out in just a moment. You've been there a number of years, Alejandro. Just finished an MDiv here at ACU, and a wonderful, remarkable preacher and leader, and a great storyteller. So Alejandro, great to have you with us today as well.
Thank you for the invitation.
You're welcome. We've been looking forward to this conversation very much today. Before we turn to Randy and let him set a bit of the context for us today, let me just say a couple of words for logistics' sake for our guests today. We want to make sure that you're chatting with us in the chat feature of Zoom. Let us know where you're at, and you can talk to one another via that chat feature. If you've got questions, and we're going to take questions as we go along today, we want you to use the Q&A feature that you'll find at the bottom of the screen, the Q&A feature. And that's where we'll pull up questions for the second half of our hour today. So as best we can, let's engage together in the community that's present in this Zoom space. Speaking of community, it's always good for us to pause and remember that God is present with us in this space. So I'm going to invite you to enter into a minute of silence as we invite God to be present with us in this important conversation. Would you bow and express your prayer in silence now? Eternal presence, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, hear our prayers and use this time to call us deeper into the practice of your mission for the sake of your name. Amen. Well, Randy, I'm turning to you here. The demographic shifts in our world in the United States is changing rapidly, and our towns and cities become more diverse. Why does a conversation like this matter to those of us in ministry?
Well, I think our tendency is to immediately think about, how do I evangelize those people? But I think there's actually a bigger, conversation to be had. I grew up in Northwest Arkansas, Bentonville, Arkansas. It was a sleepy little burg when I was growing up there, not the retail center of the universe as it is now. And I did not know anybody closely that didn't look like me or sound like me for the first 18 years of my life. And then that started to change. And the last third of my life, the world has opened up. And every time I've gotten to bump into Christians who don't look like me and sound like me, I've learned more about what God's doing in the world, and the world has just gotten more beautiful and wonderful. So the one thing is we don't really know what God's doing in the world until we pay attention to what he's doing everywhere. So that, I think that's one thing. I think another thing is our panelists will help us get clear about some language, but the Hispanic church in America is not the same as the church in Mexico City or somewhere in South America. It's its own thing. It's this kind of hybrid culture. And in that way, it becomes a kind of laboratory where you try to figure out, okay, what happens when the gospel bumps in to this kind of hybrid culture? And as all cultures in America are going to become increasingly hybrid, that's going to be an important lesson. So I'm anxious to hear what our panelists can teach us about what it means to be a Christian in North America and an increasingly hybrid culture.
Yeah. Thanks, Randy. That's lovely. And that's probably a great place for us to start. Omar and Alejandro, I'll turn to you here. When we say Hispanic culture or brown church, should we be using an S? Cultures, right? Get us started here. We can't just paint everything with a simple stroke of a brush, right? It's much more complex than that. Alejandro, you want to get us started?
I want to, if we go in order of ages, from the younger to the older, I think I'm going to go first. So I don't know if you agree, Omar. So yes, you are totally right. Every church is a cell, and it has its own personality. Latino, when we say the word Latino and we use Hispanic, sometimes people use it like if it was a synonym. But they're not. They're actually not a synonym. But the culture is so rich, even in the language. We all speak Spanish, but people in Argentina speak a totally different Spanish than me or than I in Mexico. The accent, the food, the traditions, and all of that permeates the church. And which it's very interesting when you come to the United States and you are in a metropolis like Houston, where you have Argentinians and you have Hondurans and you have people from Guatemala. It is something very unique that happens only here in the United States. So understanding that difference, that's a huge step in in understanding the Hispanic culture.
Yeah. Add to that, Omar. How would you flesh this on out?
Well, let me just say that it is a diverse context. You have so many people that are so a mixture of cultures within cultures that's why this brown concept comes into a good focal point, because it's just that mixture of cultures. Where you have that word mestizaje, where you combine the European with the Native American, you combine those two, then you get this brownness that a lot of times within ourselves, there's a variety of us. You have a lot of mixtures of Quechua with Spanish, or, some other Aztec with Spanish. And you get that now in the United States. You have this English speaker, Anglo speaker with the Spanish speaker, and the combination of those two, you create this new brownness, this new mestizaje that is interesting, and we need to address it.
Right. So it's in some ways, some people will call this a liminal space, right? It's It's not white or European. It's not African or Black. It's something yet some other thing.
Yeah. No, what I was going to say is within that, even you have these other African Americans, you have all these Caribbean backgrounds that as you combine them within themselves, then you begin to create this brownness, so this liminal area that it's almost like it's not one or two, it creates a third culture, like a new perspective that is totally new.
Yeah, Alejandro, let me turn to you here. I know that you've you've got a lot of experience and your roots are down in Mexico. And I know we've talked a little bit about how a lot of Hispanic culture brings Catholic frameworks into play. And talk to us a little bit about what it means to take the gospel into some of these Hispanic contexts, these brown spaces, and what might white church leaders need to keep in mind?
Well, when the Church of Christ, let's talk about the Church of Christ in general. When they came to Latin America, they brought all the Church of Christ mind and tried to put it in a ex-Catholic mind, and that's kind of a tension. But the problem is that this gospel that the missionaries brought, it was a gospel in some sense like broken, I would say. It was a gospel of salvation, but then transformation. So it was like going and telling them, we're gonna talk to you about a heaven and eternity and how to, one day you're gonna be, all your problems are gonna be solved. Well, that's true, but that's a broken gospel because there's another part where there's social transformation. Yes, Jesus is not coming back yet, but your function in society is to transform what is around you. Not just the gospel of salvation, but also the gospel of transformation. I think sometimes there was also I would say a broken worldview where there was conversations about creation and also the fall, but not about the redemption that comes after. So I think that created some issue with the preaching of the gospel in Latin America. I don't know if you agree, Omar.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's this mixing of ideas that we've had over the years that they compound, right? They get to be all the way from Spanish, religious views to as you combine them with throughout the centuries. And I think that's what this brownness is addressing to. We need to look at those 500 years of history that we've had in Latin America within all these layers of mixing ideas that as we put the denomination or our tradition in there, it just makes another layer that we have to deal with. And I think to be able to identify those layers is the hardest thing to do as a church, because you don't want to discredit or take away a few things that are valuable to others. And I think that's this concept of identity. How can we find identity within this combination of layers that maybe overlap the core message of the gospel?
Go ahead, Randy.
Well, and I assume that that's also a generational issue. You both have children who are young adults. Are they more assimilated, less assimilated than you are? Are they more hybrid, less hybrid? Are the things that matter to you the things that matter to them? How's the generational thing play into that?
For me, I could probably speak into this a little bit. I go to a bilingual church, right? And we do everything in both languages. And my kids don't necessarily prefer that. So they actually go to a different church that only speaks one language. So because they're able to understand both languages and they feel confused in the process. But that little confusion with just language, it's also in a lot of things that I see. The way they see God, the way they even want to connect with God is the different way that I connect with him. So like I said, they end up being like a third culture. And I think we talked about this before, but like in food, you can illustrate it with food. You get this combination of flavors sometimes these kids make that is not Mexican and is not from Texas here, but they create like this third flavor, and it's like, so not what I like. And it's not what other people might like here in Texas, but these kids do. And then when I see them with their friends, they love it too, like all the hot Cheetos and all this other stuff that they eat around here. So spiritually, you have that, right? You have these churches that are a combination of whatever they saw with their grandma, their abuelita do, right? And how they practice these things. And then they go to school and they get to see this church thing and they go to a church camp. So now you have this like third way of doing church that is not necessarily my preference, but is really what speaks to them.
And something that I think might be worth it to mention is that there is a new term, actually. Brown church is not a term that it's been long time, but it's kind of new, but represents not a color. It's not a bad term, but it's a term that encompasses tradition and theology, because the brown church not only influenced social justice but also theology. The way a Hispanic theologian thinks about the second coming of Christ is probably a little different than an Anglo-Saxon person who reads the Bible and makes theology. So that contextual, whatever the word is, contextual, what is the word? Tell me.
Contextualization?
Contextualize.
Thank you so much. You sound, it sounds great. Contextualization, whatever.
En español.
En español, contextualización, exacto. Contextualización of that theology is very, very unique for a Latino theologian. So that it's what it's called brown church, the brown church, with all these cultures and traditions and language and stuff like that.
Let's pursue this a little bit. I think it was Omar who said a minute ago that maybe we need to remember that that Hispanic peoples have been a part of the Christian faith for hundreds of years, right? There's a legacy here that many of us who are white or Euro may not fully reckon with. Let's unpack that just a little bit. There have been Latino communities of faith for 500 years in North and South America, right? So what's the legacy that comes through that tradition that might be important for us to put on the table?
Well, I think what I've learned over the years is that, you go through school, you go through all these education processes, and some of these voices that are part of that 500-year history are not heard. You get to study a lot of the European voices and all these theologies that are great, they're good, but they're within their context, right? They have a German background, they have whatever other European or Anglican backgrounds. But then when you look at Bartolomé de las Casas or all these people who were in Latin America, they lived in the Inca Empire, and they get to speak to us in how they saw the sharing of the gospel, or how they connected with the Indian that lived in the Andes or even in Mexico, then you get to see how people contextualize, or they used what they had in their time to be able to reach them, and to evangelize them. And I think part of that stuff is just very connected to liberation, right? Latino is all about liberation theology, and we have this concept of being oppressed, and we have oppression over us. So we tend to think only freeing people from something. But when you have now this new brown church that is becoming a community in power, they have identity, they have degrees, they have voices. They don't have necessarily the language, because a Hispanic doesn't have to speak Spanish. It has a Hispanic background. Then you begin to see that theology has to be more than just liberation. We have to start thinking, how can we integrate all these things? How can we make this complete, by looking at the history that we have in order to speak to us today? And I love that about it, and one time we talked about this in a class, that we tried to restore the New Testament church so much, which is a good practice, but we skipped like 2,000 years of history, and then we tried to talk about heaven so much that we don't talk about the now, we talk about the later so much. So we're like disjointed, you have this missing piece of history, and then you have this missing piece of the now. So I think the brown church can speak to that. It connects us to the immediate context, and also our present, which is a social justice part of it.
And I think something that Randy said about when in the beginning, you said, Randy, I knew people only similar to me, similar to the way I talk, the way I dress, and I think a key to develop the understanding and a way to reach out to Hispanic community is also getting to know them and knowing this part of history that shaped the beginning of what we know now as Latin America, it's very, very important, because the way that Latinos and Hispanics here in the United States act and live is the consequence of this 500 years of history. So, and we can, in some way, we cannot, it is hard. It's hard to hate someone that you know. When you know the past of somebody, or when you know the story of someone, it is hard to develop hate for that person. In fact, you develop empathy and love and closeness. So I think one of the first things that we have to continue doing is knowing each other. I got a gift from my dad. He gave me this book long time ago, and it's in Spanish. It's in Spanish. Except I saw that you were trying to read it's in Spanish. It says the true story about the conqueror of the New Spain, and it was written by Bernal Díaz del Castillo. This guy was 90 years old when he wrote this book, and he wrote it because he went with Cortés. He went to several missions as a Spaniard, and he went from Guatemala to Cuba to Florida, to all over the place. And in the end, he retired, and he heard all these crazy stories about how Cortés was a hero, and how, many stories that were wrong. And he thought, I'm 90 years old, I'm still strong, I'm gonna write what really happened. So I think this is a great resource to begin our quest in knowing the Latino culture, and why we have these issues today that are a repercussion of what happened in those 500 years.
I'm guessing, partly from conversation we had earlier, that COVID has been particularly hard on Hispanic communities and churches, not just because many people have died, but because you have these deeply, what do you say, very physically communal people who are now being told to socially distance.
Yeah.
And it's been hard on everybody, but it seems to me it brings particular hardships on certain kinds of cultures. What do you think?
Omar, do you want to?
Okay, I could speak maybe to that. Our experience with our church, it was very much like that. Our congregation did not want to stop meeting, and some people never stopped meeting. They still would meet every Sunday, even with the COVID restrictions, because the concept of you have to see your brothers or hermanos, hermanas, right? Like, you have to be able to continue this relationship, and our prayer request have become longer and longer every Sunday. Our announcements get longer and longer because you're praying for the nephew, the cousin, the brother. Like, it's an extended concern about this, and as it gets global, then it becomes a more global conversation. But I think what it does is it helps us understand that those are the characteristics that we can find within the history. What are good pieces of theology that we can learn from the Brown Church, and we can cherish those instead of just saying, I'll get used to it, get an iPad or get an iPhone or whatever. You can connect to Zoom, and some of these things that people might not be able to easily connect with. And that's that sensitivity, that sensibility that we need to have. Because not everything in the history of the Brown Church is precious, right? We have horrible stories. We have terrible scenarios. So not everything within the Hispanic community is great. There's a lot of issues that we have to deal with ourselves. But I think just valuing those things in a time of crisis is good for us to be able to welcome those goodness and to cherish them and then celebrate them.
Well,
So-
when you think what's one of the reasons the Hispanics go to church, sometimes one of the differences you see is white Americans, they go to church, they're probably looking for a sermon, a lesson, their worship. Latin Americans is more like oh, I'm gonna see Sister Juanita. I'm gonna see Brother Carlos, and I'm gonna spend time, and we're gonna be together. And even in the singing, it's very particular, because in the singing is not the purpose is not to make a melody, a combination of bass and baritone, and that's not the purpose. The purpose is sing. So everyone is singing loud, because we are like one body, and even this, sometimes the leader says, sing louder. Oh man, that's like a joyful noise, like the Bible says, but it's beautiful, and that's part of the practices that you will see very, very different. Yeah, that just came to my mind. I don't know why.
Well, just let's track that on out just a little further. Talking about practices, what are some of the practices that emerge from the brown church, from Hispanic cultures, that might need to be lifted up, that we need to put into a larger conversation? We've kind of hit on the value of community and relationality, the expressiveness and worship here. Alejandro, you note that, but what are some other resources or gifts that might come to the larger church that we need to take note of?
I think I could say three real quickly. One, language. You have to welcome what language. You have to welcome accents. You have to welcome diversity within the language. And if you can express Jesus is very different than Jesus because how we pronounce it, right? Language is a big thing. The other thing is food. We have to celebrate food. The diversity in the food that we have in our cultures is amazing, right? Not every Hispanic eats tacos, it's like there's a huge diversity in food, so that could be long too. But the one that I think is most important for us at churches is the concept of beauty. Hispanic theology has such a beautiful background, and there's all these images, there's all this imagery that you come along with, the connection with even the skin color, the connection with beautiful mountains or the scenery of people's faces. And you see it when you go to the store, to the markets, they have this connection with beauty. I think being able to connect with art in our churches, be able to celebrate those things, that would connect better with the church and with the people that are trying to be attracted to this church. The language, the food, and the art behind it.
Something to also, in adding to what Omar is saying, is an excuse that I often hear from leadership or members of the church, members of, let's say, a white church, is, oh, I cannot relate with Hispanics because I don't speak Spanish. And language, I assure you, is the least that a Hispanic church is seeking or wanting from you. There's this guy that I love. His name is Daryl, and he used to be an elder at Bamel. And I remember having a conversation with him, and I said, Daryl, will you be willing to come to our services on Sunday and be there? And he was, well, the first response, the classic response was, I don't speak Spanish. And I said, me neither. I mean, I barely do. Even I don't speak English. I barely speak Spanish too. But he said, okay, I will do that. Just sit there. I'm gonna write my sermon in Spanish and in English just for you. So you try to follow me, whatever I'm saying. And he did for 6 months, and he loved it. The church, they couldn't talk, to each other, but love is the language, actually. And you can, people can see your real interest, that you're really interested in them, just by being there. And they will they will look at him knowing that he's not understanding anything, and they will be, oh, poor Daryl, pobrecito, he doesn't understand. But he was there, and he became a dear friend for many of the members of the church. He now is a part of the board of Baxter Institute in Honduras. He's been in missions where, everywhere, even in Cuba. He has been everywhere. He became a friend of the Hispanic culture. So I think efforts like those of Daryl make a huge difference. You don't have to be a theologian of the liberation or understand all the enigmas of the Catholic Church, or even speak Spanish. You just have to be this willingness to love, because as I said before, it is hard to hate someone that you know. I think it is very, very important to mention that.
So that's interesting on practices. I'm also interested, if you can do this sort of briefly, on theology. So I'm a dominant culture theologian formed by all those Germans. From your point of view, what would likely be one of my blind spots? What's one of the things I probably need to learn from Hispanic or Latino theological tradition that, I've always compared it to a theater stage where you have shadow and lighting. The higher the light is on one part, the darker the corners are over here. So what are the dark corners that I may not have seen because I've been shining the light someplace else?
Before you guys jump in, let me just say to our viewers, we kind of play this question out. I want to be moving to questions, so please feel free to drop some questions into the Q&A box there. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about theology here.
Well, that's a very good question, because that's the type of question that I've been asking myself for a long time because of my formation, the way that I've been brought up. But I think one of the blind spots that we have in our theology is a lot of times, and I include myself in that, is we want to be very logical and very conclusive, very, very much Renaissance, we want to be able to explain everything, interpret everything, and correct it. And a lot of the things that we see in the Hispanic Latino churches are coming out of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of immigration, a lot of losing families, a lot of hunger. That kind of place does not really work with all this logical and correctness, as I say. And a lot of times the church, we might have a great, awesome sermon that is exegeted correctly, and you have the right hermeneutics, and you were faithful to the text, but it does not speak to the person who's sitting on the outside hurting. So our theology has to become very much available to those things, and we need to change some of that. And I think what I'm trying to say in short is, a lot of times our theology is very much academic, and we need to change it to be more relational, to be more mystic, to connect to these art pieces, this food, this community of relationships. And I think that would bring a different type of theology. It makes us feel uncomfortable because we don't want to be sometimes so subjective that you're on the other end, you end up with no logical part of it too, but that's the tension that you have to live with. But I think be willing to stretch our hands out there and be willing to listen and have a cup of coffee or just whatever, and create these spaces. And they're all going to be different, right? If you're in Oregon, it's going to be different than if you're in Mexico City, or you're in Houston, or even Lubbock. So being able to connect that. And I think that's what the Brown Church does here. And I love that concept. We're not advocating for this brownness, like, hey, this is the way it should be. What we're advocating is that we all come from different backgrounds, and as we combine those backgrounds, it creates a third background and this new theology. How do we engage that process? And I think to be that flexible, that open in theology, that's what I would recommend. And I know there's a lot more to be said here, but those are the few things that I can think of.
Something that always comes to my mind when I have in this type of conversations is that perception. Sometimes I feel that the perception of the Latino or the Hispanic is that it's an immigrant who doesn't know the language and doesn't have studies, and it's a limited thinking person. And it's just a perception. Many of the people that migrates to the United States, they have an undergraduate or a graduate degree over there in their countries, but they're leaving because hard situations, and most of them, they don't want to be here in the first place. The first generation Hispanics, we always talk about, that day when I'm become viejito, old viejito, I'm gonna go back to my city and I'm gonna stay there, and this idea of being in a different country is hard for them. But they are prepared people, they are educated people. And I think that's something that has to be fixed, has to be changed. The perception that we have of immigrants. The book that we were talking about sometime, Brown Church, makes an extraordinary job in talking about immigration. Robert Chow, he says, if we take away the concept of immigration from the Bible, we lose everything. And I think that's very interesting that we also have, on the other hand, this type of hard conversations with immigrants, not just among our people that look like us, but with immigrants, with people that are suffering. The concept of immigration will sound very different in white ears than brown ears. So, but the conversation has to happen between both groups in a way that will bring wellness for all.
Thanks. This is a great conversation. I think we can, let's turn and pick up some questions here to focus this for a few minutes. We've got one questioner just asking a practical but real question about how do you effectively incorporate Hispanic culture and worship practices into a white or an American service without unintentionally creating tokenism. Would one or the other, or both of you, want to play that out a little bit? How do we create, in some ways, Omar, that sounds kind of like this, how do we move between the dominant culture, this emerging culture, into that, you've been using the language of a third culture.
Yeah, a third culture. I use two different words that I could think of. We need to be sensible. You need to be interdependent. You can throw the baby with the bathwater, right? You can't just all of a sudden go one direction and everything else is wrong. And you can swing that hard. So you need to realize that we need each other. There's interdependency is a God-given thing. We depend on each other. So there's that need that you need me, I need you. So there's an equality. So making sure that we do that and being sensible, like what is that really person needing? How can I converse with them? It's almost like a parent raising a child. I raise my daughter so different than my son, and they're both my kids, because they're so different in what they need. So I need to be sensible, because I could yell at my daughter and she responds different than my son if I yell at him. So the action is the same, but the response on each of them is different. So we need to realize that. So as we change things, I think the key here is we need to get used to being uncomfortable. We need to get used to being vulnerable. We need to be used to whatever, because later we're going to have these conversations because we're going to be very dominated by Asia. We have Chinese influence, and you have this Chinese that, like you go to LA and they used to have a lot of Spanish, and now they have a lot of Chinese, and it is, so we're going to be speaking about this other third, fourth culture created. So we need to have these practices. And once you have these in place, you're sensible, the interdependency, it creates new habits, new ways of seeing things that regardless of whatever comes, another culture, another language, that we can welcome those in. And being vulnerable, being okay with being weak, making mistakes.
And out of that, how can that be tangible? Because the question is not just to have Hispanic people in your church. Okay, let's bring all the Hispanics, go to the other place and bring all Hispanics. It's not about having Hispanics or Latinos in your church. It's not about that. It's if you don't have a Hispanic community around you, it will be weird if you don't have one, because we are everywhere, we're everywhere, but it will be weird. And but if you don't have one, and you don't have this actually desire to go the extra mile, I will ask you, I will invite you, don't try it, because it's messy. It will require for you to be uncomfortable. So reaching out to any kind of community is difficult. But how can I make it tangible? If I already have a Hispanic group in my church, how can I show that they are important? I think first, with dignity. Dignity, that's a very important word, dignity. If you have immigrants that are working as mowing yards and they are working in low paying jobs, they don't receive dignity at all during the whole week. The only place where they are going to be treated with dignity is going to be church. They become brother fulano, brother, sister. They have a name. They are important. So if a way to show our Hispanic brothers and sisters love is through dignity. So, for example, if you have a worship center that has, screens and sound system and it's top of the line and it's beautiful, make sure that the place where Hispanics are worshiping, it's top of the line too, because that speaks about dignity and respect. And that's something very, very, very important in the Latino culture. Dignity. You never speak up to your father or to your mother. You never talk back. It's respect, it's dignity. And that's ingrained in our system. So I think that's one very important thing to mention.
I've had over the last 2 or 3 years a few students who have Hispanic last names who speak less Spanish than I do. It's really interesting. And one student had a double L in his last name, and I pronounced it like a Y, like I thought you should, and he very quickly corrected me. I mean, he's anglicizing his own name in terms of the way he pronounces it. And there's a tension there with those second and third generation, right? It's the same one we have in the Anglo church, where our kids are sort of walking away. What is church for the next generation of the brown church look like? Or are we all going to assimilate into one big mass, or what's it going to look like?
I'm going to just say a quick thing, Omar, because I know that you have a better response than I. But there's an extraordinary book by Daniel Rodriguez from Pepperdine, and he wrote a book titled "A Future for the Latino Church." And he found that the Spanish churches in the United States have made an horrible mistake of pushing more the importance of keeping the culture, the Latino culture, and the language, than reaching out to the souls of the young people. So yeah, we end up losing thousands of young people because we are trying to push them to be more Mexican. Oh, and even among the Mexican culture is, oh, you're not Mexican enough. Why? Because number one, you're too white to be Mexican. Number two, you don't speak the language as you should, and the music you like. All this comes to the church, and I think that's a huge mistake. But a great resource that speaks about that is Dr. Rodriguez book.
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying exactly. I have a student that I call her Maria, and she told me my name is Mariah, not Maria. So I totally understand that. And the sad thing is that that is her name, Mariah. I mean, that is who she is, I mean, you might say it this way somewhere else, but this is who I am. And I think that's the concept of this brownness. The core concept of brownness is identity. We need to have, who am I? Who am I in all this mess of things, And I think what it comes back to is, how do we connect with the dynamic things that are happening in this mixture of ideas and concepts and skin color and foods and all these things? What are the dynamics that are happening so that we can see God at work in those places? So if we can move to those places of being a sensible person in this mixture or this hybrid happening, God can work through that too, because we are a mixture of somebody else. We are a brown church from somebody else. You might have Scottish, or you might have some other roots, but at the same time, it's like Alejandro said, you don't want to just be this Mexican power, which is what a lot of people do. So you end up with very much an extremist perception of this, and political and very conversational. But as Christ calls us to love, to serve, to wash feet, to be in a different type of culture in this world, I think we can find those places by being sensitive to what God is doing, how the Spirit is at work in this place. And the best way to do it is ask the question, are you Maria or Mariah? And if they say they're Mariah, but from there on, you're Mariah, right? And from there on, you're going to be that. And if you want to be Maria, that's fine too, but then two different places. And then we welcome Maria or Mariah in that place. And I think as a church, it's hard because both sides hurt, because my wife is not Hispanic, is not Latino. So we talk about this all the time. I live with this every day. We have these two cultures in our own house, and our kids become those two combinations. And like I said, they're neither. They're not Mexican, they're not American. They end up being a third culture, and I think being sensitive and loving them, I'm going to love you either if you like tacos or you go with your mac and cheese. You're my child. Or if you're going to mix your taco with your mac and cheese and make a mac and cheese taco, which is so weird. But again, that vulnerable part, I'm going to have to be vulnerable with that.
That doesn't sound healthy.
Yeah, it is nasty, but I've seen it. I've seen it, like a taco with mac and cheese, or like I've seen tacos with sushi, it's like, so that is weird. Like I said, it's vulnerable, and if you talk about church or theology, whenever you have a prayer and people are moving their hands or they're in a posture that is different, that's the mixture of ideas. And then we just kind of scratch our head and we want to correct it. And instead of just welcoming that thought, those practices.
Yeah, we've bumped up to this a little bit, but again, I want to kind of come back around into it again. Oftentimes, the dominant culture church, the white church or the American church, we've used the language of being blind to some things. There's assumptions that are just on the table that we just assume that you're going to change and come and be like us. And so I want to probe that a little more. Where do you see some blind spots in the dominant culture churches in the United States? What might be some places that we might need to hold a little looser, perhaps, in many of our churches that would open up the possibility of moving toward these new spaces that you're describing?
I think a simple one that comes to mind is nationalism. We need to get over our nationalism. We're called to a bigger calling from God, goes beyond our personal histories. That's one of those things that is so hard to get out because we are a very Christian nation. The States is a very Christian nation, and whenever you see somebody praying with a flag on the back and all this, it connects to this national pride. And I'm not an anti-American, I'm an American citizen as much as a Mexican citizen, but I think that's one of the areas, and that could be very sticky and very complicated, especially recently with our politics involved and all this racial critical theory that attacks all these things. So I think that's a blind spot that is there a lot of times because of power and gain. Also, I think don't victimize the Hispanic culture. There's a lot of people who are very capable thinking people, that image of the brokenness in Latin America and all that stuff exists, but you have these great people of faith, not to victimize the Hispanic. Also, the concept that not everything's great in our end, okay? I could say that because I'm brown, and I could tell you that there's a lot of stuff that we need to correct. So there's some ownership that we need to take on our end. There's some parts that we need to take control of that. And I think that's part of the conversation that we're doing here, and I'm glad that we're doing it, because we need to have a brown church conversation. So the brown people need to be talking. The people that are talking about these things are the ones that have the experience, right? Because we have seen that neglect in a lot of places. So churches, a lot of times, you're going to have to do that, just kind of open up and be willing to listen to some people. Create those spaces, hey, Saturday we're going to have this, invite some people, give some guidelines, and it's going to take some transitioning. There might be some sticky places that you might hit yourself on the wall, but as you find these vulnerable places, then we learn from that too. So I think those are the few that I can think of right now. But ultimately, I think as a church, as a whole, there's been a lot of welcoming in our community, and I honor that too. There's been people have stretched out and they've tried to help so much that's good. You know, you get to see it, and new generations coming up. So I would applaud that too in the conversations to own the path we have.
And as you mentioned, Omar, we have also to work among ourselves and many stuff that we've been dragging for years. One of the things is that this type of conversation sometimes doesn't happen even in the brown church. Sometimes the brown church doesn't talk about the brown church itself. And I think those conversations also have to happen. Second, for example, one of those items that we have to discuss is the colorism that exists in Latino culture too. You know, this difference that happens, or this segregation that happens even today. And again, I would say as the result of the 500 years of the conquest, where the light skin becomes the dominant and the indigenous becomes a lower level. But those are conversations of transformation that have to happen in our churches, in the Latino churches.
Thank you for that. There's several questions here that have popped in, and I'm just kind of curious about this one, so I'm going to ask it. This maybe gets a little geeky, but to go back into thinking about the tradition, the theological tradition that comes through the through the Brown Church legacy. One participant's asking about where did it go? I lost it. About the various sources that inform Brown theology. It's a fairly eclectic array of sources, which I think, and I'd like for you to speak to that, which is, of course, the case for all theology, right? It's none of it just drops still, fully merged from heaven. But you might take a moment and just explore a little bit what are some of the sources, the varied sources that inform theology within a Latino or Hispanic world.
We just recently had a class there at ACU with this concept of the Hispanic theology, and we talked about how Spain was conquered by the Moors for 700 years. So you have this background of religious competition and heresies that whenever Spain became so Catholic, they became so zealous of their faith, by expelling all these Islamic kingdoms that was brought to America. So they forced and they beat everybody to becoming this one belief. And I think there's an array of Catholics here, not just one group, but there's a lot of goodness and a lot of bad. And how do we differentiate that history? So I think it's influenced. We have a lot of Islamic roots in theology, the Brown theology. Like we say, ojalá, when we want to be wishful about something. In Spanish, we say, ojalá, that you're wishing Allah would do something about this. So we still have those roots within our Hispanic theologies. We have a lot of this Catholic view that is very much zealot driven. Those are the things that identify us. Plus, on top of that, you have these influences of different groups, like the Franciscans and the Jesuits, and you have these other groups within the Catholic Church that they saw the conquest in different flavors too, that they didn't all agree on how to do it. So you have people who advocated for this and advocated for other things. So those are the roots that we have to see there too, the Carmelites and all the other things. So as we look at the history behind those things, that's already muddy. Our theology is influenced by this Islamic, by all these array of Catholics that we have. And then you add the politics, and the politics is a huge part here. Our theology is influenced by politics heavily. We have somebody in Venezuela, you have one in Cuba. These people have influenced heavily our theology, the way that we see and we interpret these things. Because these men or these women become saviors to Latin America. They become images of Jesus almost, and they create theology. So I think being able to differentiate all these things be able to know where they came from, and going back to scripture as much as we can to be able to find those differences. It'd be important. But definitely it's a huge amount of information, 500 years of history in Latin America, but like 700 years in Spain. So it's like a lot of information that it creates this to be a very confusing thing. And like Alejandro said, even within our own brown heritage, we don't know it because we thought it was not important. It was not part of the conversation.
And that is why Church of Christ became very, very accepted among Latinos, because Church of Christ, in some sense, had a very defined set of beliefs and ways to practice things, and it was relieving for many Latinos to find something that is clear. Okay, 5 steps of salvation. Oh, that's good. That's perfect. 5 worship acts or acts of worship. 5. I mean, it was easy. It was handy. It was clear. And the problem is that it became very dangerous because now I have the truth, and churches became very seditious, very separatist, very, very. It was bad, but it was because of this diversity that Churches of Christ brought a sense of stability, I shall say.
That's helpful and good, and those same realities exist within any particular tradition of the church, right? We have always got to be prepared and be in the process of engaging in and reflecting on why it is we believe what we believe, and be able to subject it to critique. Well, we're coming down to the end of the hour. I could keep this going. Omar and Alejandro, it's been a lovely time. I'm going to just ask each of you, and Randy, you as well, what would be your last word today as we kind of reflect about our conversation? What would you want to leave with today as we wrap up this conversation about Brown Church? Omar, I'll just start with you. What would you say?
I mean, the first thing I would say is thank you for this conversation. Definitely is not a comprehensive one based on time. So much to talk about. So I think that would be my last word, to encourage these type of conversations to happen, to be able to continue to be Christ-centered as much as we can, and actually hear what he has to say, what he did, because that's going to trump all these things. It's going to be the solution to a lot of our discussions, being very much formed by the Spirit in this likeness of Christ. There is an advocation that we need to have for the Brown Church, and I do that, and I have done, and I will continue. But at the same time, there's ownership, responsibility that needs to come out of this from all places, because we owe it because of Jesus. So thank you very much, and I hope that as we share, we continue to share some of these sources and resources and stuff, we can expand this conversation further. So thank you.
Thanks, Omar. Alejandro, what would you have to say as we wrap up today?
Well, I also will thank you guys. Number one, for the invite. When Rene told me, will you be interested in having a conversation with Randy and Carson? I said, sign me in. I don't care what the conversation is. I don't care. Let's talk about UFOs, whatever. But sign me in. So, and second, I will say, let's keep this type of conversations, because it is nice to talk with friends about this type of things, but let's keep talking about this in other spheres, in other arenas, because as long as we know each other, we can combat hate when we know each other, when we get to know the other person. It is very, very important to know the background of the other part, because when we know others, that makes things easier.
That's great. Randy, what would you say?
I think that so much of theological resources are now available in English that we often forget where we got them. And it's easy to forget that the most influential Christian theologian who ever lived outside of the Bible lived his life in Africa, St. Augustine. or the single person who's been the greatest influence on me outside of the Bible originally wrote in Spanish, Juan de la Cruz, St. John of the Cross. And, you got to be open to all the places that God works. And if you develop the eyes to see and the ears to hear, there are echoes of the divine just all over the place. And we just need to quit being so provincial and allow God to be the God of the world, and to be discerning about that, to be reflective, to be critical of our own tradition and others. But who knows through whom and God is going to show up.
Absolutely. Thanks, Randy. And I want to thank each of you who have been participating with us today, our viewers. Thanks for tuning in today. I know you join with me in thanking Omar and Alejandro for their time and wisdom and insight and humor and earnestness as we look for and pursue the presence of God in all of these places. I want to thank Renee Paul, our logistics event coordinator, and the staff here at the Siburt Institute for all their technical work and bringing this all together today. Also, as we wrap up, I want to just invite you to our next intersection. It'll be 2 weeks from the day, February 9. Our guest that day is Dr. Scott Cormode. Scott is a professor at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's an author. He's got a brand new book out called The Innovative Church. We're going to talk about adaptive leadership and what does it mean to innovate. Scott comes with a wise, practical, and theologically informed set of frames that I think will make for a delightful time on February the 9th. So as we close, yes, thank you.
I just want to at least, why don't you go ahead and put in a board for the book as you're closing up.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, one of the many sources that we've heard a lot from several today in the chat and by Omar and Alejandro, and I think we'll be sending out some reading guides for you here in the next few days for those who've been here today. But one of the leading titles of that is a book called Brown Church by Robert Chao Romero, and it's just out about a year now, and it's a lovely introduction to some of the deeper themes that we've been exploring today. And so just commend that as a possible resource for you as you continue your study and work. Okay, we get everything in? I think so. Well, Randy, would you close us out with a benediction?
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who is able to keep you from falling and to present you before his glorious presence without fault and with great joy. To the only God, our Savior, be glory and majesty, dominion and power through Jesus Christ our Lord, before all ages, now and forevermore, world without end. Amen.